Buick's history spans the birth of the automobile and takes it into the 21st century. It's an enterprise that was built by carriage makers and laid the foundation for the world's largest car company, General Motors. Buick's story chronicles the growth of the American automobile business and points the way to its future. Buick celebrated its centennial in 2003. It threw itself a party in downtown Flint, Michigan. Thousands of people and hundreds of classic cars filled a park near the location where the company got its start in May 1903. These loyal Buick owners, Buick club members, former employees and car enthusiasts soaked in all the Buick lore on display. The grounds in front of the Alfred P. Sloan Museum were reserved for a special collection of rare Buicks. Later that week, Buick was the honored mark at a car show at the Cranbrook Academy. Everywhere you looked, there were cars dating from the time the first Buicks rolled out of the factory. It was a feast for auto lovers who got an up-close look at history. Great luxury cars from the 1930s reminded visitors of bygone elegance, while dream cars from the 50s took visitors back to the optimistic post-war world. A time that could also be somewhat impractical and even a bit silly. Both events made it clear how important Buick had been to the growth of the automobile industry. 100 years ago, when Buick was just a dream, there were over 1,000 car companies vying for the public's attention. It was a time of experiment and growth, similar to the tech boom at the end of the 20th century. Like companies founded in most booms, the majority went bust. There was no guarantee for Buick when it was launched by an expatriate Scotsman, David Dunbar Buick. He loved to tinker, and by the mid-1890s, he was building engines for farm machinery. One of his employees, Walter Marr, shared his passion for engines. Marr built a prototype car in 1900. Buick and Marr then raised the money to build a second car. The car had problems, and their backer wanted to unload the company and recoup his $3,500 investment. By that summer, Buick found a group of wagon makers in Flint, Michigan, who would take the risk and finance his company. By September of 1903, the new investors had moved David Buick and his company from Detroit to Flint. They formed the Buick Motor Car Company. While these were the formative boom years for the auto industry, the average person wasn't convinced that cars were here to stay. Racing was a great way to convince a skeptical public that these were reliable machines and to whip up some excitement. Auto fever started to spread. In 1904, David Buick convinced Walter Marr to once again help him build a car. The first Buick built in Flint. Marr and Buick's son tested the primitive car on a drive to Detroit and back. They rolled out on July 9th, 1904, and returned 3 days later. Unfortunately, Buick's investors were losing patience. They wanted to see more cars built, not just tested. They all agreed that only one man could help: Billy Durant, Flint's leading carriage builder. Durant had succeeded by buying and combining component companies and placing them under his umbrella. He'd bought wheel, axle, varnish, paint, and carriage top companies and had moved them to Flint. He wasn't that enamored with automobiles, but he saw that these contraptions might be the future. Durant went for a test drive and was so impressed with the capable vehicle, he decided to plunge into the automobile business. He took his cars to New York for the auto show in January 1905. He sold more than 1,000. The company had produced barely 40. The remarkable demand helped Durant convince Flint bankers to finance the building of a new factory. To establish a Buick dealer network, Durant relied on his existing carriage company dealers located all over the United States. His energy pushed production to over 700 cars in 1905. 1 year later, Buick was producing 2 models and building nearly 1,300 cars. By 1907, the factory was turning out 6 models and 4,600 cars. But the real competition was coming. Henry Ford introduced the Model T in 1908 and helped put America on wheels. Durant wasn't ready to cede the race to be number 1. Buick also introduced a new model that year, the Model 10. Over 4,000 Model 10 runabouts and more than 4,800 others rolled out of his factory that year. This made Buick the number 1 seller of automobiles in the United States. Durant outgunned the combined sales of his closest competitors, Ford and Cadillac. He'd been transformed from the king of the carriage builders to supreme builder of automobiles. To pump up interest in his cars, he organized a racing team. The lead drivers, Louis Chevrolet and Wild Bob Berman, were colorful characters who won races, entranced the public, and the reporters covering their exploits. The racing effort rested on 2 Buick 60 Specials, or Buick Bugs. Chevrolet and Berman each drove one of the sleek and speedy cars. Their 105 miles per hour top speed was phenomenal. People wanted to buy a Buick after witnessing the Bugs race. While these drivers were proving that the automobile was a viable means of transportation, Durant was creating an automotive colossus. Unlike most people, Durant recognized what Henry Ford's Model T meant. He tried to buy Ford's company, but he couldn't come up with Ford's $8 million asking price. Durant kept looking for other opportunities. He bought Oldsmobile and housed it with Buick under the roof of a brand new company, General Motors. Durant quickly added the luxury car builder Cadillac and a mid-priced model, Oakland, later to be known as Pontiac. Durant was riding high, as he assembled the pieces of a vertically integrated corporation, as he'd done with his carriage company. Buick sales provided the majority of the cash he needed to keep his enterprise afloat. But even Buick couldn't bail him out when he fell $14 million in arrears. A weakened Durant was forced to turn over majority control of General Motors to the bankers. They quickly ushered in a new president, Charles Nash. Nash hired another future auto baron, Walter P. Chrysler, to turn things around. While Durant nursed his wounds, he forged ahead with a new company named after his racing star, Louis Chevrolet. Chevrolet Motors was born in 1911. He set up shop in his old Flint Wagon Works building and began to amass as much GM stock as he could. Johnny Raskob, a key advisor to one of the world's wealthiest men, Pierre DuPont, was convinced Durant was a winner. Raskob suggested DuPont purchase both Chevrolet and General Motors shares. Durant welcomed DuPont's help in his quest to regain control of General Motors. By 1916, their combined holdings were large enough for him to march back in and throw the bankers out. By 1917, the United States was embroiled in World War I, and Walter Chrysler turned his attention to Buick's efforts to aid the war effort. Buick turned out Liberty aircraft engines, ambulances, and tanks. When the war ended, the DuPonts looked for ways to use the money they'd made selling gunpowder to the Allies. Investing in General Motors seemed like a good bet. Durant broke ground on a new headquarters for General Motors. It would be the largest office building in the world. Unfortunately, a post-war recession struck and sales plummeted. GM's stock fell with sales. Durant stepped in and bought loads of stock on margin. He couldn't stem the collapse, and then his creditors stopped lending him money and demanded their $27 million. Durant didn't have it. Pierre DuPont saw an opportunity and told Durant he'd give him $35 million for his General Motors shares. This rescued Durant, but once again forced him out of General Motors. There was nothing else he could do at the time. Alfred P. Sloan was named president and took over Buick and all of General Motors. Through various holdings, the DuPonts became one of the largest suppliers to the corporation. Under Sloan's leadership, Buick and the rest of GM prospered. That is, until the stock market took a turn on what became known as Black Friday, October 29, 1929. Wall Street crashed, wiping out an estimated $50 billion. Millions lost their life savings. Buick and the other car makers watched their sales tumble. By 1933, Buick production had slipped to about 40,000 cars. Its Flint factory let go thousands of employees. Sloan turned to Harlow "Red" Curtis, the 39-year-old president of AC Sparkplug, to revive Buick. Like Durant, he was a terrific salesman. He set out to bring back power, speed, and sales to Buick. Curtis challenged GM's chief designer, Harley Earl, to design a Buick he would like to own. Earl was partial to Cadillacs, but he turned his team loose. They created an exceptional lineup of cars, some of which have become timeless collector cars today. Curtis and Earl helped to send sales back up to almost 200,000 cars. Buick was looking healthy again, but Flint was headed for turmoil. Workers had suffered during the Depression, and finally labor exploded. In December of 1936, the Flint sit-down strike started. Auto production came to a stop. The workers had a list of long-term grievances that management had ignored. Strike-breaking tactics that had worked in the past didn't shake the resolve of the Flint workers. President Franklin Roosevelt and the governor of Michigan stepped in and compelled the two sides to start bargaining. Finally, an agreement was reached. Local 599 at Buick would become the United Auto Workers' largest GM union branch. People were back to work, and Buick sales kept growing. By 1940, Curtiss would celebrate topping the sales record set in 1928, when over 250,000 Buicks left the showrooms. Buick's customers loved the stylish cars that Harley Earl's designers were turning out. Earl used his own custom car, called the Y Job, as the inspiration for Buick's lineup. His personal dream car was a head-turning, low-slung, sleek vehicle that was the envy of everyone who saw it. Earl loved its aerodynamic lines that eliminated running boards and novel features like electric windows. The Y Job was the future personified. Earl and Curtiss were on top of the world. While Earl helped America dream with his dream car, there was a nightmare approaching on the horizon. World War II erupted and transformed everything. There were no more thoughts about building new cars. It was time to turn out tanks, planes, guns, and bombs. Finally, the war was over, and it was time to gear up auto production again. America was poised for unprecedented growth. The economies of Europe and Asia were a shambles. Detroit's car makers had an open field and responded with audacious, humongous cars like Buick's Roadmaster that ruled the roads. It was an era that screamed excess is best. Bigger, newer, bolder was better. Buick's designers were at the forefront of the over-the-top but confident styling charge. The public loved it, and by the middle of the decade, Buick was selling 500,000 cars a year. Buick's designers were selling more than cars. They'd embraced Harley Earl's styling dreams and created show cars that stirred America's imagination. Earl traded in his Y Job for the jet-age LeSabre. This long and very low car looked like it was ready to take off. Once again, Earl used his dream car as a daily driver. He was the undisputed king of American auto design. He created a companion car, the XP300, for GM's head of engineering, Charlie Chain. GM launched the Motoramas that traveled the country to show off its dream cars and production vehicles. It lured people in to fantasize about all the cars. These theatrical events excited the crowds and gave the press plenty to write about. Buick's signature portholes were first seen on a show car during this era. On the show car, there were lights under each one. While the American public flocked to gaze at the dream cars, they were also streaming into dealerships and buying cars. Buick sales kept climbing. Zooming from 550,000 in 1950 to 745,000 in 1955, Buick became number 3 in sales. As the decade wore on, what had seemed fresh began to look outdated. It was time for a new styling direction. In 1959, Buick and its sister divisions at GM launched a new, slimmer and winged look. Buick not only changed the shapes of its cars, but adopted new names. The Century, Super and Roadmaster were out, and Invicta, Electra and LeSabre were in. An economic slowdown in 1958 suddenly made smaller cars popular. Buick responded with the Special in 1961. Its aluminum V8 engine made it more powerful than a Volkswagen. It was also roomier. Buick sales rebounded with the economy. By 1962, it was again building more than 450,000 cars a year. Buick's big news for the era came in 1963. The fastback Riviera rolled out and was instantly anointed a modern classic. Buick sales continued their upward swing throughout the 1960s, but peaked when they racked up more than 821,000 in 1973. No one believed that anything could go wrong. Unfortunately, the bottom dropped out when OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, launched an oil embargo late in 1973. As gasoline prices soared, sales of Buick's big gas guzzlers sank below 500,000 in both 1974 and 75. It was becoming clear that Buick was out of step with the times. Some American buyers began to desert Detroit and sample fuel-efficient imports. They discovered that not only were they gas misers, but better built than their old American cars. Buick, along with the rest of the American auto industry, began to search for a new direction. Fuel economy, safety, quality, reliability, and durability, more friendly dealerships, salespeople that didn't belittle women buyers, all of these demands began to pile up on the doorsteps of the automakers. It was a time of tremendous change. Buick struggled to remain the builder of premium American motor cars. It built new factories, launched new products like its two-seater, the Reatta, tried to revive brands like the Roadmaster, but it couldn't ignite public passion. Buick started to look for ways to attract younger buyers. They turned to people like golfer Tiger Woods for advice.
Well, it's neat to be a part of a process in which Buick is catering to a younger consumer, and it's really neat to be a part of that. I'm really not that old, and it's really neat to be able to see a brand changing its image, and I'm trying to help as best I possibly can, and it's really neat to be a part of that relationship. That is impressive right there.
Buick began to create concept cars that were sleek and sexy, roadsters that could drive them into the future. It had taken years for Buick to rebuild its identity. Finally, as it approached its centennial, the company started to show that it was turning around. New products were on the way. It looked like Buick had found the road to the new century.